Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are. This is Mike Volkov, and Happy New Year to everybody, even though it's past the time that Larry David says you can say Happy New Year, which is 15 days is his rule. So, but anyways, Happy New Year to everybody. Good to see everybody. Thanks for signing up and showing up for the Ethics and Compliance Review and a look at trends for 2026 as we sort of skate into the new year. It's going to be a good year, and I'm glad that everybody could make it. I did upload the slides, so if you can, and I apologize that I did it just 10 minutes before coming on, but if you want to download it, that's fine. And then if you can't download it because of firewall settings or whatever, just email me at mvolkov@volkovlaw.com. It's on the front page here, mvolkov@volkovlaw.com, and I'll send you a set of the slides. I do record all of these webinars, and they are on our compliance channel, the Volkov Law Group compliance channel on YouTube. And so this will be recorded in case somebody wants to, have somebody else listen to it at your company or at your organization, whatever it is, to make sure that people get access to it. If you think it would be helpful. So anyways, welcome. It's a new year. Just a reminder that we're going to look at sanctions and trade enforcement generally on February 3rd. That is next Tuesday. Same time, 1 o'clock. Here's the sign up link. I think as you'll hear me talk about today, this should be at the top end of your list for risk and priorities for the upcoming year. And there have been a lot of developments in terms of trade enforcement that people should be aware of and make sure that you are working on it, because I think it should be at the top of your list. Okay. So that's just a reminder. We'll see you here next week. We'll go through OFAC, BIS, DOJ's new role, and most important, well, not most importantly, but importantly, the use of the False Claims Act with regard to trade enforcement issues. So that's a big development. So what's our agenda for 2026 look like? 2025 was a tumultuous year. There were new risks that came up, new priorities that came up, and we all tried to, deal with them. And sort of a decline in the FCPA enforcement. We had resources moved around. We had new priorities. Cryptocurrency, for example, was not as regulated in the new administration. So the SEC pulled back. So there are lots of issues here as well. Somebody said, I still see the title slide. I hope you can see it. Let me make sure and look at the settings that you all can see the slides. Let me see on sharing. Make sure I've got that. There you go. Let's see. That should be better now. Hold on. Okay, can you see it now? I want to make sure that works. I apologize for that. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So you didn't miss much. It was just a slide. The first slide was to remind everybody about the sanctions and trade enforcement review for next week. Anyways, the risk landscape is definitely, it changes quickly. We are managing, I think, to a new risk profile in the sense of that anti-corruption issues from the United States are not as significant a risk right now. That doesn't mean, and as I've said many a time, you don't dismantle an anti-corruption compliance program. You have other risks overseas. And of course, you have fraud that could be closely related to it as well. And you just, for your own company's perspective, you want to maintain your code of conduct and your commitment to anti-corruption. We also have changed enforcement priorities. DOJ, for example, has put in more resources into immigration, moving some of them from the fraud area, in the criminal fraud area, into immigration or border enforcement issues. In a tumultuous time, the stakeholders and shareholders and everybody, their expectations haven't changed for what they expect you to navigate. And obviously with, tariffs and trade and issues going up and down with regard to those issues and the impact it could have on your company, this is the time where I say this is basically, it's even more important, given this situation, to focus on your culture, focus on your values, focus on all of the basic foundations of your company, because it's an interesting dynamic, and I don't know if you all share the same perspective, but as, let's say, it's more tumultuous in the political, in the social world, what I'm seeing as a very significant trend is that employees and managers and people within the company are raising their expectations and seeking comfort or seeking stability within their jobs and within the way that a company's culture operates. And they want a safe workplace, but they also want a place that they can believe in. So that's why I'm saying let's focus on our culture and values, and this will come up more as we go through the slide deck today. So what are we looking at for our top 10? And I hate to harken back to David Letterman. It just shows my age, I guess. But the top 10 list for legal and compliance risks, and let's go through them quickly. One is at the top, from my perspective, is trade compliance, sanctions, and export controls. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail today, but we'll go into much greater detail next week. And there really is a lot going on here in terms of DOJ taking a lead role, in terms of the False Claims Act being used by the task force that was created for trade enforcement within DOJ. I always say, look at the resources, where they go, and you can tell what DOJ's priorities are. Number one, they've moved people to the National Security Division within the Justice Department, which brings trade compliance cases. Number two, they've moved people into civil fraud, which moves into their trade enforcement and use of the False Claims Act in terms of bringing more cases. And even some of those cases, at the end of the year, we had a big sort of False Claims Act case related to trade that came in December. That the one thing that's happened is this administration has been very aggressive with regard to trade compliance, national security issues, and False Claims Act prosecutions. And I always have told people, you think the FCPA is bad, wait till you see the law with regard to the False Claims Act and how broad it is. So it's a huge weapon for the Justice Department to use, and it's one that they're gaining more and more momentum, and I think they're going to be a bigger year even this year. Now, they did report this year $6.8 billion in terms of False Claims Act recoveries, which is huge, and a big significant increase over the last year as well. So False Claims Act, that means you have to look on your import side and tariffs and duties, and with regard to your industry in terms of imports and industry sources. The False Claims Act now is being Two of the significant cases from last year were whistleblowers who were competitors of companies. And that opens the door to a lot of interesting issues. I did represent a competitor years ago here in California who brought a False Claims Act against the company, and it turned out pretty well. They got a recovery, and the CEO of the company ended up getting jail time for illegally importing or not paying certain duties. The number three issue by far and away, cybersecurity and data privacy. This continues in our age of technology, and compliance, from my perspective, plays a very important partnership role. This is, and we'll talk about that in terms of cybersecurity and data privacy, because compliance has a really important role here, and they need to play that role, and they built partnerships with their CISOs, that being the Chief Information Security Officer. Now, number four, to reinforce the sort of trend that I've seen in terms of promoting, managing, and monitoring culture, this is something that I'd like to see everybody sort of grab onto, take responsibility for, and then bring this culture idea of promoting it, managing it, because in the end, your culture is your best control. There's no better control, because you want people to believe in the company. Rates of misconduct decline. This is really incredibly important. It's your most valuable intangible asset, yet somebody is not managing it, promoting it, monitoring your culture to see where there are declines, and those are important. New technologies, and this is where we get into the artificial intelligence issue, data privacy, data breaches, but most importantly, this artificial intelligence issue. Now, I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian and say that artificial intelligence is absolutely an important new risk. But I do think there's a lot of sort of hyper bloviating about it in some respects, because it depends on what your use is of artificial intelligence. If you're using it for an algorithmic purpose that is central to your business, you make loan decisions, you have real estate decisions, you have other things that take into account potentially improper factors in your algorithm, that is one set of risks. That's a high risk use. But most people are using artificial intelligence in a supportive manner, in an addition manner. In other words, being more efficient, monitoring financial transactions, creating certain documents, even in the marketing realm. But those risks are significant, but they're not the be all and end all. And there are a new set of risks in terms of intellectual property, data breaches, third-party vendors that you're using who may not have great AI controls. That's what we're talking about. So that's definitely an issue for everybody to look at, and for everybody to see what they think in terms of applying it to your risk profile. Third-party risks cuts across everything. Now, I've listed here cartels and TCOs, transnational criminal organizations. Obviously, this is a big issue because of the administration's focus. One of the cases that the administration brought involved alleged relationships with the cartel, an FCPA case. But I should have listed even more here. Artificial intelligence is a third-party risk. Cybersecurity is a third-party risk, and data privacy is a third-party risk. So we need to look at those. And of course, sanctions and export controls are third-party risks as well. So it cuts across a lot of issues, and there's more focus because of that, and the sort of expanding level of risk to getting your third-party risk management program together. And that means building on a technology foundation and building controls around it. All too often, I see sort of a a claim of we're managing this, but then the business doesn't embrace it as much as they should. And it's really important to have controls to stop certain transactions when you haven't done any third-party due diligence or screened anybody in connection with that. Your supply chain, which relates again to your third-party risk, but I've made it a separate entry only because we're seeing obviously imports, and False Claims Act is part of this, but more importantly is a rising expectation with regard to proper use and screening of your vendors and understanding the supply chain, because we all don't want to be caught in a reputational situation where, let's say, we have an input and several layers down in our supply chain where child labor is used or forced labor is used. And we, of course, have the Forced Labor Act, Prevention Act here in the United States. So that is something we've got to stay on top of, and we'll talk about that. Now, closely related to your culture, and closely related, and this is the area where I've seen greater impact in, let's say, the last year to 18 months, more raising of conflicts of interest issues internally and sensitivity to this. And this has raised, and it's I put it on the sort of top 10 list to just remind everybody, what kind of conflicts of interest program do you have? Are you, and usually compliance runs it, and consults with legal or whatever, but usually compliance runs it with an annual certification and disclosure process that includes the C-suite and the board annually, and basically mines the conflicts of interest. And we saw a lot of sort of high-profile scandals that occurred, and in terms of conflicts of interest with regard to relationships. And you read all the time, Nestle's, the head of Nestle had an improper relationship. And we're seeing situations with improper relationships which are clearly going to undermine your culture. And that's all that, if that is allowed to go on, and if that person, for example, who's having the relationship with a subordinate, protects that subordinate, gives them higher bonuses or higher raises, then that just is a surefire way to undermine. Government contractors and executive order priorities. The reason I link this, we didn't see some great increase in government contractor fraud prosecutions, but I only put this down because there are various executive orders that have been adopted, DEI and other things like that, that this administration has adopted that are influencing government contracts and requiring certifications and requiring some potential enforcement risks as we head into this year. And I think we'll see a few more. It's not going to happen quickly like it did before, but in 1 year, like it's not going to happen, but it's going to become a more significant issue. And we, of course, have to acknowledge the impact that the immigration enforcement, workplace raids, and disruptions are having in obviously, in Minnesota, there's been a lot of disruptions, and you can imagine the impact that that has on companies and workforces in Minnesota. But it's cuts across a lot of. It's not just Minnesota. There's an increase in workplace raids, and if your business depends upon an immigrant workforce, then this is something that you have to be careful about and to acknowledge. But anyways, that's our top 10 and sort of guides some of our discussion as we go ahead. Now, how do we where do we prioritize our compliance efforts and strategies, and some of which reflect the sort of fast-paced world that we're dealing in with regard to trade and tariffs and duties. When there's a threat of raising tariffs. People are still waiting. For example, in Venezuela, we've obviously seen a huge political change, and we're still waiting to see what kind of changes, if at all, to the Venezuelan sanctions program occurs. Now, that could, and I think it will, they're in negotiations now as to how to address the sanctions program. So, well, my number one message again is prioritize trade compliance. That means having your policies straight, your training program, annual training is required for sanctions screening, for sanctions compliance. Your screening program has to be controlled, and you have to have escalation procedures. I've seen a lot of effort now being made with end user verification techniques. You can't do it in every case, but you have to prioritize that. And we'll talk about this next week. I'm seeing people using a more regular audit, like even a monthly audit sampling of certain trade transactions to make sure that they're done in compliance. Tariffs and duties fall into this. Tariffs and duties, and by that I mean also if your industry has had countervailing duties imposed as a result of a dumping case, those carry the same significance as tariffs, and circumventing those duties just as much as circumventing tariffs can become a major headache and prosecution. Major priority has to be your third-party risk management program. Please don't let it, just because you don't have anti-corruption at the top of your list, you need to have TPRM. I love the new lingo for that. Third-party risk management as a major priority, given cybersecurity and data, which is now, and I've seen more and more people sort of bringing them a seat at the table, so that when we're reviewing potential third parties, we know what kind of data and cybersecurity protections they have. Leveraging our culture and ethics, that means making sure our senior leaders are communicating on this. Take advantage of some of the easy technology that's available. Video a message from the CEO once a month. I saw that with one of my clients, and it was really terrific, and people watched it. This is a way to communicate and get the message out on the importance of culture and ethics. Just deal with your AI risks and tackle them head on. I just wrote 2 blog postings on our blog, Corruption, Crime, and Compliance, on AI risks, and gave you sort of an outline of what your AR risks are in the non-algorithmic situation. The algorithmic is a totally different situation. But here, when you're looking at it as a supportive addition role, you need to do a risk assessment and then tackle the controls head on. Conflict of interest has to be, please ensure that you have a conflict of interest disclosure program, that you have a mechanism for people to bring potential conflicts to your interest and to your attention. I've seen many more hotline calls and issues raised surrounding conflict of interest. When people see it, they just don't like it. They respond to it. And in a company that you have a strong culture, you're going to see these kind of concerns come in. So the more that you can tackle this, the better. But please, 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 we're not so concerned about the person who says, I want to serve on this board, and it's going to take 5 hours a week. Outside of the company. No, what we're concerned about are conflicts of interest in the business sense, conflicts of interest, obviously with relationships, but in the business sense, where certain executives may have advisory board roles with a company that's a vendor. Things like that. And the classic case of bringing in a relative as a vendor is another one to always look out for. Conflicts of interest tend to link eventually to fraud. And if you don't deal with those in the business area, you could have more fraud. Cybersecurity. This is the continuation of partnering with IT. Your CISO, your chief compliance officer should have a seat at the table. What is compliance good at? They're good at training, risk mitigation, policy writing. All of this can be done to support the CISO, and the CISO plays an important role in all of this. Your supply chain and legal compliance and business risks are critical, and we've talked about those in terms of uncovering those. Links close to your third-party risk management program, but also requires you to dig deep into supply chain. I mean, we are eventually getting to a situation where, and I'm not trying to cause anybody some concern, but a lot of this reminds me of conflict minerals and the exercise that everybody went through then. But there's sort of expectations growing on your supply chain, knowing who's in your supply chain, what kind of prohibited or activity that you don't like. Leverage your data analytics. In other words, use it in compliance, use it across the organization. We have access to lots and lots of data, and compliance programs generate lots of data. Use the data and monitor your third parties always. Please, everything that we're doing in terms of monitoring and auditing is going to be by sample and sampling, sampling, and sampling. And this depends upon working closely with your internal audit team, but also more and more people are leveraging their data analytics, and it's freeing people a little bit of time in the compliance department to do something else. Enhancing your monitoring risks, and this is the world is rapidly changing. What a profound grasp of the obvious there, but the point is that I get more and more questions on people who want to monitor and track regulatory changes around the world, because when we don't have a standard that's being adopted by everybody, you can get different data privacy type concerns. You can get different regulatory requirements with regard to, let's say, gifts, hospitality. If you're in South Korea, you run into a huge issue with gifts and hospitality. So this is, we have to be able to enhance our monitoring of risks and changes and behaviors. And that is a real challenge for us right now in terms of staying on top of all the regulatory changes that may be occurring as we're going on. Okay. So artificial intelligence, I mentioned algorithmic use equals a high risk, support use equals a medium risks. Remember, we have lots of regulatory risks out there. You don't have a federal statute governing AI, but you do have an executive order. We have a European Union law or whatever framework, and then we're seeing more and more individual states in the United States dealing with AI issues. Where you get into issues is the algorithmic use and the generative AI in terms of making mistakes, intellectual property, reputational harms, and basically leaking of sensitive information that can get picked up in an AI type of system. So be very careful, and you need to adopt an AI governance structure. We need to have, just like any other significant risk, depending upon the business use case and where you are in using it, you have to get in place an AI governance structure. And that usually, if you have, let's say, a senior executive or a compliance committee, we build it into that. But these are the important things, and the content. When you're using generative AI, you have to make sure your content is screened and reviewed. From a just pure narrow legal and compliance issue, using AI, it's riddled with mistakes. Case sites that don't even stand for what the case allegedly is being cited for. And it was scary to me when I first started to use this, and I double check everything now, and lawyers have gotten into big trouble by just relying upon AI for legal work. That's a reminder to me about all the risks that we all face when using these AI tools. So we have to be careful in that respect. Trade risks, and I'm not going to go into detail here in terms of make sure it's a priority item. We've seen tariffs here, tariffs there, the threat of tariffs, and broad-based tariffs raising prices. There's uncertainty and disruption to the supply chain, which means you have to be there to support potential changes in your supply chain, and they have to be done quickly according to the business. They need it quickly. We're seeing surveys about how much of the additional cost of the tariff is actually passed on into pricing. A lot of companies, I think, sort of bit the bullet and took it on and didn't pass it on with a pass through to consumers. But it goes up and down. But we are in a volatile global trade war situation. We have various tariffs, but there are a lot that are threatened and get hot headlines, and we sort of now know to sort of wait and see how it may play out. And they're country-specific tariffs, but probably the two most important that I see are steel and aluminum. It gets really, it has a big impact on inputs. And this world is an up and down world with tariffs, and it does have a huge impact on the government. So I think it's really important. In terms of trade enforcement, and again, I'm going to go into this in much more detail, DOJ's elevated role and the Trump administration has sort of carved this next to national security interests. And it makes sense when you think about it. The DOJ is taking on an elevated role now in organizing prosecutions of individuals and of companies, and we're starting to see that rapidly increase. Exports and imports, the regulators, OFAC, BIS, have all said, look, penalties are going to be higher. Be careful about your third parties. And then we have the new False Claims Act. And when I say new, it was used years ago for tariff and duty evasion, but it was a really rare case or incidental. Now it's a regular tool that's being used. And remember your cartels and TCOs and hidden parties and hidden benefits. Interestingly, I'm seeing some trade secret theft cases on the increase, as well as cybersecurity issues of concern. DOJ has the twin hammers. The left side is sort of the criminal prosecution. The right side is the False Claims Act. We also have a new corporate enforcement program, which basically translates down to if you cooperate, if you disclose early, you're going to get a declination, not a presumption, but you're going to be declined. And one of the big trade cases that we're going to talk about tomorrow, a company acquired another company and then found out that the acquired company was continuing to do business with Iran, and they turned over the case, cooperated, disclosed, and the CEO of the acquired company was criminally prosecuted, and they were let off in a much easier way. Their priority on trade compliance is tariffs and customs fraud, sanctions and export controls. Logistical networks are really under their focus. And remember that the whistleblower program at the Department of Justice was expanded to include trade compliance issues. They want to see competitors. They're encouraging competitors come in and tell us what people are doing. If you come in and tell us because you're going to get a benefit from it. Now, so we have a driving force, like I said, of national security. The National Security Division has increased resources. They also, interestingly, assigned some additional resources to the Banking Integrity Unit, which is in the Criminal Division of the Money Laundering section. And there they're going to pursue global banks again on sanctions issues. So that will be interesting, although I think it'll take years for us to see those cases. The US is now, like the Justice Department, is coordinating regulatory agencies and bringing cases together. And we saw a case, which I'll talk about tomorrow, next week. Customs and Border Protection was part of it. So you had all the regulatory agencies. DOJ leads it, just like the FCPA and the SEC's role with regard to the FCPA. And I mentioned the Trade Fraud Task Force, which is an important, and basically companies are now facing the FCPA model, in quotes, in regards to trade enforcement. Now, with regard to imports, this is where we're in a new area in terms of potential fraud. And the areas that we're seeing here of concern, and these are sort of False Claims Act cases, is misclassification of goods, underreporting of the volume of, let's say, the items, failure to declare, that goods are coming from a particular area, and circumvention of tariffs, people trying to get around it through transshipment to say, hey, it didn't come from China, it came from here, and there's a transshipment point used as a way to justify that. And we've seen a lot of cases tied to China sanctions or China duties that had to be paid in the tariffs, and people were importing and trying to circumvent these risks here. And we've seen valuation, misclassification, country of origin, and DOJ warned everybody. They said they're going to go after this, and they definitely are going after it. And we saw a big case in December. So the CPB is now, or CBP is playing a bigger role and focuses on tariff enforcement, duties, fees, country of origin. All of these items are itself up now. Remember, you're using for classification, you use your codes, the HTSUS code. HTS is what I call them, and your proper valuation. And remember to keep records in their record keeping requirements. And remember that customs brokers can be high risk. So your mitigation for trade risks is always the 5 elements of a sanctions and export compliance program, and trade compliance policies, and a policy, an overarching policy akin to anti-corruption, and prohibits violations of trade and sanctions laws and regulations, covers dual use if you have dual use, and includes an anti-boycott policy. So you want to have an overarching trade compliance program headed by a policy, and then build underneath that all of the things that you need with regard to your particular risk profile, be it sanctions, be it dual use, or even military items if you're involved, and then you have ITAR risks. But these are all important elements, and you have to have a representation of the importance of this issue to you by building a trade compliance program. Years ago, trade compliance was sort of off to the side. There was 1 or 2 people doing it and became technical experts at it, for example, in the dual use area, dealing with BIS. And now we need to integrate those folks back into the overall compliance program because of the significance of this risk. So we look at a new risk assessment. I like to revisit trade compliance, revisiting your policies and procedures, your suppliers, your logistics partners, annual audits, or I've seen monthly audit period, sampling tests, and obviously monitoring tariffs and rulings that come out from the trade court, particularly on countervailing duties. We map and manage our supply chain, and remember, they're always, we'll talk about that as well in terms of tariff compliance risks, but business you have to be able to move. I've seen more effort put into being able to adapting your supply chain and being nimble in the process of moving from one to another in terms of a supplier who may become itself problematic, and then you got to move to that. We always forget third-party risks, and I try to remind people that you need to know if you're selling to a distributor, if you're exporting to a distributor, you need to know where the product is going. Where is it going? And you need to know who's going to get it. You can't just sell to a distributor, call them, recall them, or recategorize them as a customer and then say, I don't need to know anything else. That's not true. If they're reselling or redistributing the product, you need to know where it goes. And particularly if they're going to go into support a military operation in Russia, and you have to be aware of these things and stop these things. There's nothing more troubling than seeing your products or used as inputs and found on the battlefield in Russia. You can't, and Ukraine. You just can't be in that situation. End use assurances and documentation are even more important now, and more people are using it as a very good compliance tool. And I think that we should continue that effort in making sure that we're getting end use assurances and documentation. And obviously, proactive auditing, sampling of our third parties is really important there. With regard to sanctions compliance, remember we have KYC, we have red flag issues. Geo-blocking is important to make sure if we're doing sales, online sales, that they're not going to prohibited countries, and we use our IP address for that purpose in geo-blocking. Third-party scrutiny in high-risk areas. I've seen too many cases. Dubai, if something's going to Dubai and it's going to a third party there, you've got a big Iran risk. If it's going to China, you've got a North Korean risk. Eastern Europe and Turkey, you've got a risk of Russia. And so we always, or Belarus, so we're always looking at these situations in terms of third-party scrutiny. I also think of Miami the same way. If it's going to Miami, I need to know that it's going to stay in Miami and not end up in Venezuela or some other prohibited person. So, and remember, there's an annual training requirement for sanctions compliance. Not the whole company, but annually responsible persons have to be trained every year. Renewing our culture commitment. And like I said here, the headline is, it's a best control. It's your most effective control in a fast changing world. And it cuts across all the risks. So ethical culture is your business currency. And there's greater demand. People will engage. Employees will engage. Engagement increases when there's an emphasis on ethics, an emphasis on your values, and an emphasis on speaking up. All of this goes together. And remember that reputational risk is what can be your biggest harm, your biggest damage, your most significant hurt to your company can be from something like an ethics issue and a reputational issue. So you don't want to have child labor in your supply chain, even if you didn't know about it until you uncovered it, because the reputational risk is so significant. But remember that ethical companies, the message is consistent. Lower employee misconduct rates, greater tenure, in other words, longer tenure, increased productivity, and in the end, sustainable growth over a long period. In other words, not that you will be profitable, but if you are profitable, it'll increase the profits a little bit, and an ethical culture is going to make it more sustainable. Remember, we have the benefit of the ethics premium, which comes from the most ethical companies in Ethisphere. And I love this because there is a premium of 7.8% from January over the last, let's say, 5 years in terms of greater growth and economic performance, improved economic performance. So that's what the premium is important. And it's a way to sell and it's a way to promote the importance of compliance and ethics. Is this function, it's not a cost drain, it's a money maker in terms of maintaining it and making the company perform better and employees perform better and employees are even more satisfied with the work. And that begins with a culture assessment. And I urge you, please start to look at doing a culture assessment. Establish a baseline. What are your misconduct rates? Keep track of all your trends in terms of employee reporting, not just on your hotline, but who's walking into offices and making complaints, who's raising concerns with their bosses. We need to track all of that information because it's critical to monitoring your culture and identifying risks before you get into a bigger problem. So I urge people to measure and report on company culture. Compliance, take it on. This is my responsibility, our responsibility, and here's the steps we're taking, and I'm going to report it to the board or to the audit committee or whatever committee I report to say, here's what we're doing with regard to our culture, because it is our most valuable, intangible resource, and report on it. What are we seeing? Do targeted surveys, do culture interviews, do culture inquiries, whatever. Do things that can uncover how people perceive the work, how people perceive the leaders, and the culture of the company. DOJ gave us, in terms of from its compliance guidance, gave us some questions to ask. How often do you measure your culture of compliance? And don't rely upon the annual HR survey where you fight to get 2 or 3 questions in. I'm talking about do it yourself. Does the company seek input from all levels, senior, middle management? And what steps have you taken in response to your measurement where you've identified potential issues? Conflicts of interest I've mentioned. Remember how a conflict can undermine your corporate culture in the hiring and promotion, the relationships, vendor selection, that your decisions are being made based upon what's in the best interest of the company, not to further the interests of any one individual. The common conflicts we see of use of company information, financial interests, use of company assets, gifts and hospitality is actually just a variant of that, but vendor relationships are really important in that sense. Policies and procedures. So outline your general principles, include common hypotheticals. How much of a publicly traded company can you own before it needs to be disclosed? That's not a big risk, but I'm just saying have certain principles and rules set out and address these specific issues of corporate opportunities, board memberships. It gets more difficult the higher you go within your company. And you can't excuse things just because it's at the higher level and they say, oh, yeah, I would never make that a conflict. You need to be even-handed in the way that you handle it. The automation of the approval and disclosure process is critical in terms of using an automated tool for your conflict of interest disclosure process every year, because you can track it, you generate data, it's easy to use, and then you need a process by which you review the responses and make sure that those are in good shape. Cybersecurity, we see, and in terms of the complexity of it, but compliance plays an interesting role, and we have a togetherness between the CISO and the Chief Compliance Officer. 2 years ago, I think NAVEX reported the most significant change in the Chief Compliance Officer's work and relationships was the partnership with the CISOs or the IT department. And that is IT learns from CCOs, and CCOs, we learn from CISOs, and good ones in particular. And information governance from the CISO's point of view, to me, the most important thing is the ability of the CISO to speak English to the board or to the senior executives. All too often, I've seen them getting lost in technical descriptions that really don't accurately capture or communicate the issues. A lot of times I've seen boards that just say, "Are we okay?" And the CISO says yes. But that's not what I'm talking about. The best CISOs are going to get in there and break it down and tell the board or the audit committee or senior executives, here are the risks we're facing. We need to do this for this risk, or we need to do that for another risk. Tell me what you want me to do. Now, we as a CCO, we offer complementary skills. Why? We have line of sight across the organization. We know how to conduct risk assessments. We know how to do policies and procedures. And most importantly, we know how to do training, which is really critical in this area. The companies that do a lot of training exercises regarding phishing, people love those and respond very well. So training is really important, and reporting to the board. Obviously, a CCO is good at that and can be supportive to the CISO in all of these areas and offering assistance. It's just a good partnership to have. And it really, with AI and all of that now at the forefront, this becomes even a more important issue. So I like to see IT, compliance, legal, working together, security, human resources. I mean, look, the more the merrier, or the Beatles said all together now, but that's really what we want to see in terms of data governance. The threats are always evolving. Ransomware, continues to sort of top the list with cloud security, everybody moving to the cloud or moved to the cloud. We now see cloud security issues. And look what happened just, last week, Verizon, or a couple of weeks ago, Verizon suffered an outage. A lot of that was caused through a cloud security issue. And that's what happens these days. So cloud security, if it happens, if there is a breach, if there is some kind of problem, it can have major impact. So map your data profile. Where is your data? How is it stored? And how can someone gain access to it? Access credentials are really important. Software vulnerabilities and maintaining when you get updates and patching procedures, those have to be done. I've seen breaches caused by the failure to patch. Certain, let's say Microsoft, something in Azure needed to be patched, and then they needed to do, sometimes if people don't do that, they run into a problem down the road. So access control must be minimized. Third-party actors obviously create vulnerabilities. So let's talk about our supply chain and our upstream and downstream. I like to say we have upstream where we have vendors coming into us, and then we have downstream where we're talking about distributors and agents and third parties. There's a growing demand, I think, from stakeholders on the need for supply chain responsibility and being careful and requiring some sort of sustainability, visibility, and mitigation steps into this. Some companies, depending upon your industry, have pretty robust processes. And oftentimes this is part of procurement and not necessarily part of compliance, but this is where compliance can play a great role in terms of partnering. And so this is really important to manage your human rights and modern slavery risks, sanctions and export controls, AML, social responsibility, and your reputational risks, human trafficking, and modern slavery being at really the forefront of a lot of the risks here. So we have now this, and I've mentioned it and referred to it as the holistic third-party risk approach, where you have sanctions, cybersecurity, slavery, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, ESG, social and human rights, and reputational factors that need to be looked at. And last, we have what I would call the evolving impacts and risks, immigration enforcement, cartels and TCOs, government grants and fraud, immigration enforcement, compliance with your I-9 requirements and your documentation requirements are really important. And we see that with interactions now with cartels and TCOs being a new priority, and that's where we end up. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Again, let me point out, we've got a couple of interesting questions that I want to go through, and that is, and if you have any other questions, and let me run my poll as well, and hope to see you next week as well. If you need any help in these areas, I've listed some areas. One area I'd like to see people take a little bit more attention on is your internal investigations, your hotline processes, and making sure everything is working in that. But let me take a look. We got some interesting questions along the way. Interesting question, which was, how valid are the claims from the Justice Department that false claims wins are from real false claims, given the current culture at the department? Well, I think there's a lot of activity that occurs in the department that is really focused on the traditional bread and butter cases. So I don't see any sort of manipulation with that. But, I'm looking at it right now and I'm planning to write on it about the $6.8 billion report. But that's a good question. You always have to be a little skeptical these days to see what the purpose is and what data is actually released. That's a good reminder. Given the deregulation efforts embarked by the current administration, do you expect any of this to touch sanctions? Answer is a resounding no. Sanctions is even more important for this administration because they use sanctions, tariffs, and other things as a important step in the foreign policy area. And you're not going to see any break. If anything, you're going to see more enforcement as well. Good question. What is an example of AI governance procedurally? Well, to me, you have AI, an AI use committee in the business sense that monitors and is aware of every use of AI. And then you'll have a reporting structure that goes all the way up to the, let's say, audit committee. But for example, I was surprised. I was doing a risk assessment at a company and they said, no, we're not using any AI. Then I talked to the financial people and they said, we're using AI and we use it for this purpose and that purpose. So that's why we need to have a governance committee that's going to be aware of as you look at it. Another great question. AI itself is a risk, as you pointed out. Do you have any recommendations for what we should include in the risk assessment per country and AI legislation? I think that's a good start. Also, you have the executive order on AI, the EU's regulation, and country-based regulation, if there is any. But that's a good framework to start with. Okay, also, please make sure if you want a copy of the slides, thanks again, and we'll send it to you. And we'll go from there. And I'll see you next week, hopefully next Tuesday, for the sanctions and trade enforcement review, which will be really interesting. And I'd love to get your feedback on that. Thanks again, everybody, and stay in touch.